Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Okay, the visible and the invisible. This is our third video. Still in the first chapter, reflection and interrogation. But we're moving into the second sub-chapter, the second division of the first chapter, called the Perceptual Faith and Reflection. And that actually is how I have divided this video. So the first part will be about perceptual faith, and the second part, reflection. So let's have a look at the first one, perceptual faith. So far we have basically outlined what Merleau-Ponty explicitly calls a faith. It's a kind of faith. So it's a certitude that can't be proven or even thought about. We can't even formulate it in words, in language, concepts, without distorting it. And it makes no sense in terms of the subject-object division. And that's all because this is faith, not knowledge. So there's a distinction that Merleau-Ponty is drawing straight away between faith and knowledge, and where we are now is on the side of faith, perceptual faith. But it's not faith because we lack proof. So that's important. It's not that we don't have proof of the world, therefore we have to just believe in it. We have to have faith that it's real. It's not that kind of faith. Rather, we can't even talk about proof without presupposing that we're already in a world. So the mere fact that we can ask for proof of the world is itself proof, evidence that we are in the world, that the world is real. Because if you're asking for proof, you're already there in a world to ask for proof. If you're already experiencing something, and that is what you're experiencing. Your experience is grounded in something, and that something is the world. So it's not this kind of, it's not a loose kind of faith where maybe it's real, maybe it isn't. We don't have proof either way, so let's just say that it is, and that's our article of faith. It's that in order to even formulate that question, to ask for proof, we must already be in a world. And so it's a stronger sense of certitude than what we normally think of with faith, which is, I guess, a religious kind of faith, right? Where there's no evidence for God or against God. So if we're going to live our lives as if God exists, we have to have faith, because there's just no evidence. But it's not that kind of faith. So skepticism then, for Merleau-Ponty, we've already talked about this a little bit, but skepticism is a non-starter because the perceptual presence of the world is our experience, prior to every opinion of inhabiting the world by our body, of inhabiting the truth by our whole selves, without there being need to choose, nor even to distinguish between the assurance of seeing and the assurance of seeing the true, because in principle they are one and the same thing. Faith, therefore, and not knowledge, since the world is here not separated from our hold on it, since rather than affirmed, it is taken for granted, rather than disclosed, it is non-dissimulated, non-refuted. So there's no difference between seeing and seeing the true. Those two things are one and the same. To see is already to be in a world to see is already to be in a world such that you can see. It's to be in a world in which there are things to see. So we're already presupposing the very thing that we are questioning when skepticism follows its skeptical route. So it's faith, not knowledge. But like I said, it's not a religious kind of faith. It's not a faith where there's no evidence either way, so we have to believe, we have to have faith. It's much stronger than that, because anything we do, we presuppose that we're already in a world. So it's not just that we're really sure, we're almost 100% certain. It's that this must be true. We must be in a world in order for any of these things to happen. And I quite like this last part of that quote. Rather than being affirmed, we don't affirm the world, the truth of the world, because it's taken for granted. It's if it wasn't real, if it wasn't true, we couldn't affirm anything. So the mere fact that we want to affirm it, we feel we have to affirm it, tells us we're already there. It's something that's taken for granted. Rather than disclosed, it's non-dissimulated, non-refuted. It's not something which is or was hidden and has become available to us. Originally, it was non-dissimulated. Originally, it's the very origin of everything, of your existence, of your perception, of your experience. It's non-refuted by its nature. There is no hold for skepticism here. And this is the kind of faith that Merleau-Ponty is talking about. So we've discussed dreams and hallucinations, the way that they are fragmented and they have a different structure from our lived experience. But we haven't talked about a virtual reality kind of skepticism. Could we be living in a virtual reality simulation, for example? And Merleau-Ponty doesn't talk about it either, but I thought it was interesting to think about. Obviously, Merleau-Ponty doesn't talk about it because it wasn't around at that time. But what about this? Could we be living in a virtual world? So a fake world, a world that's not real. And you'd have to say, okay, it could be true, right? We could be living in a matrix-style reality. But for what Merleau-Ponty's getting at here, it doesn't matter. That's the interesting thing. It doesn't matter if we're in a virtual world, because it's still real in all the ways that Merleau-Ponty's talking about. Whereas dreams and hallucinations are genuinely illusory. Like we said, they're fragmented. They lack coherence. There's no, as soon as you look closely at them, they kind of break into parts. They break into pieces. There are gaps all through them. There's no. And I even said right there in the first video that the dream characters, if you ever manage to dream lucidly, you realize that they're like cardboard cutouts. They're very there's nothing. They're not at all like real life, people in real life. But the virtual world, on the other hand, is real by definition. It's real not in relation to a physical world. So you've got the virtual world and the physical world. It's not real in relation to a physical world, but it's just substituted binary for atoms, right? It's substituted zeros and ones for atoms. And in that sense, it's real. It's as real as it's just another world. It's another kind of world. Right? It's a world, like I said, instead of being based on the physical constituents of matter, it's based on a code of zeros and ones. But it's no less real for that. It still has the coherence, the completeness. It's exactly the world you're living now, as full and complete as that is. And so it's real. It's as real as anything else. And that means that, so there were two kind of insights I took away from this. VR is not a skeptical claim because there's nothing to compare it to. If we are in a virtual world, this world is the only world we know. It's the only world we've ever known, and there is no other world to compare it to. So it's not illusory because there's nothing for it to be illusory in relation to. And the other thing is that, and this is the bigger point, Merleau-Ponty is not making a metaphysical claim. He's not saying the world is this concrete world of matter and physical things and atoms and so on and so forth. He's saying the world is the world of your experience. So it's a different, he's not trying to determine the nature of external reality. He's questioning the fact that we frame it in that way in the first place, that there's a subject over here, an external reality over there, and then they have to interact in some way, but they can still be considered apart from each other. He's looking at the totality, the system that those two things create, and breaking them up like that is a secondary derivative act, which is therefore abstract. The totality is the experience of the world, which is experienced as something external to me. And so that's the world that Merleau-Ponty is talking about here. So a virtual world, a matrix-style reality, isn't a threat to Merleau-Ponty's claim here, because we're still in a world, and it's as real, coherent, complete as the real world we are imagining the virtual world in relation to. So yeah, and I think the key to getting that is to realizing that it's just substituting binary for atoms. But if you do that, if you perform that, there is no difference between one and the other. And since the world we live in, the only world we've ever lived in, is that world, then that's the world that we have perceptual faith in. And so I said as well something a little bit controversial there. The world of experience. So for Merleau-Ponty, the world is the world of experience. But this is not to say that, for example, if you experience a ghost, that then ghosts are real. That's not the point. The point is that your experience of a world in which you saw something that you think was a ghost, that's real. So it's not that it's not the little things that you see. It's not the content of your world that we're ruling on here, that Merleau-Ponty is trying to judge. It's the fact that there is a world in the first place within which you can have experiences. Some experiences you have will be genuine experiences, others will be hallucinations, others will be dreams, others will be imagination, and so on and so forth. But the world is what we are certain of. And that's my next point, actually. The situation, this inhabiting of the world by our body, this inhabiting the world by our body, is what Merleau-Ponty calls our initial openness upon the world, which is a nice expression. Merleau-Ponty is great for these kinds of quotes. And this is our initial openness upon the world. It's our starting point. It's the most certain thing in the world. It's where all of our thinking begins from, all of our questioning, all of our skepticism. Everything arises from that source, from that opening. But this certainty doesn't preclude a world of phantasms, as Merleau-Ponty says. For example, imagination. So even though we have 100% certainty, we have a faith that is more than faith in the world, and yet there can be things that aren't there. We can have experiences which don't correlate to anything real, to anything genuine in imagination. And this is Merleau-Ponty's question here. How is it that perception and imagination are both possible at the same time without nullifying each other? How is it that we can have perceptual certitude of the world in itself, and yet this certitude be and yet it be possible for us within this certitude to see things, to experience things that are not a part of anything outside of our own imaginations. And this, Merleau-Ponty says, is unresolvable if we remain at the level of perception and imagination. If we stay with those two as our ground, as our foundation, we just oscillate from one to the other, from vision in the thing itself to vision in me. And there is no resolution. We're always stuck between what is the world like and what my impression of the world is, or how I am thinking about the world. And the first possible answer that Merleau-Ponty gives to this problem is reflection. And that's the second part of our video. So with reflection, the act of reflecting on experience, perception and imagination can both be subsumed in thinking as modes of that thought. So perception then would be grounded in a thought of something external to us, and imagination will be grounded in a thought, but a thought without anything external to support it. But the important thing is neither of these, perception or imagination, neither leave the circle of our thoughts. So Merleau-Ponty calls this an insular philosophical system. We never get outside of our own heads, if you like. And in such a setup, the being of the world is appearing, and its reality becomes an ideality. So we're dealing with an ideal world, and he's going to talk about this a little bit later, very soon actually. It's a world that we are constituting. So it requires a constituting thought in order for this world to exist, to be real. So with this, with reflection, we can inhabit the same world with others only because it possesses the ideal unity that makes the triangle of the geometer be the same in Tokyo and in Paris. So the world has that kind of reality. It's real in the same way that a triangle is real. And we have, so it's conceptual, right? It comes about as the result of an act of cognition, reflection. And it has, and it's that which means that we inhabit the same world. It's the same way that the triangle is the same for anyone, no matter where you are in the world. The world is the same for anyone for the same reason, that it is, it's an ideal concept. It's purely mental. It's thinking. It's thought. So that's reflection in a nutshell. But Merleau-Ponty goes on to say that he's not critical of the reflective endeavour itself. He's just pointing out that reflection is naive, he says. So reflection, for Merleau-Ponty, talks about a constituting thought and a constituted object without acknowledging that constitution requires a world, without acknowledging the fact that you're already in the world in order to see yourself as this constituting thought, to be what you think of yourself as this constituting thought, and having a constituted object. So he says this constitution requires a world which is therefore a pre-constituted world. And that's a nice little term. So he goes on to say, it is a question not of putting the perceptual faith in place of reflection, but on the contrary of taking into account the total situation, which involves the reference from the one to the other. What is given is not a massive and opaque world or a universe of adequate thought. It is a reflection which turns back over the density of the world in order to clarify it, but which, coming second, reflects back to it only its own light. So that's quite a revealing quote, I think. Let's see. So he's not saying we should replace the reflective activity with Merleau-Ponty's perceptual faith. Rather, we have to look at the whole thing. We have to look at how reflection and perception can operate together in this totality, in this total situation. And that will involve understanding reflection's role within this, and how it is reflecting on the total system within which it is doing its reflecting. So what's given, we're not given a massive and opaque world in perception, a world that we can't grasp, but it's just kind of a brute there-ness, nor are we given a universe of adequate thought, which is the reflective endeavour, the reflective activity, giving us a crystallized, clear, complete description. Rather, there's reflection which is working itself through. It's reflection which, in its reflecting, is reflecting on the world, but it's in reflecting upon it, it's changing it. There's a necessary distortion that comes about through the act of reflection. And so as we reflect on the world of perceptual faith, we have to be aware of this distortion, that is, this inevitable distortion that reflection brings to the table when it reflects. So, in short, we have to reflect. We have to think. It's the only way we can grasp things, we can understand things. But we must reflect carefully, wisely, because when reflection interprets the world, it distorts it. And that's what Merleau-Ponty means when he says it reflects back to it only its own light. So in illuminating something, it illuminates it with its own light, and that colors the thing that it's trying to understand, the world. So it distorts it. How does it distort it? Through language, through concepts, through logic, those kinds of tools, that analytical tools that the intellect brings to, the intellect uses to understand things. So, for example, when it asks, Merleau-Ponty talks about this, when it asks what existed pre-constitution, prior to the constituting act of consciousness, the constituting act of reflection, it uses the language of post-constitution. So it talks about subject, object, consciousness, mind, all of these kinds of words. But these are words that are a part of the whole reflective agenda, which agenda is a little bit of a that carries some baggage with it, right? I don't mean in a negative sense, but it's just that's part and parcel of how reflection thinks, how reflection operates with these kinds of terms. And so if that's how we are trying to understand reality, if reality doesn't conform to those terms, subject, object, consciousness, then we're never going to get a clear understanding of reality. It's always going to be biased by this post-constitution language. And so Merleau-Ponty says, and this is kind of nice, we need instead of reflection, we need a hyper-reflection. That, he says, would also take itself and the changes it introduces into the spectacle into account. So a reflection that doesn't just reflect on the world, but reflects on its own contributions, on what it is adding to the picture. A reflection that is kind of self-aware, if you like. Well, that's not right. And a reflection that is aware of itself in a deep sense. So it knows, it understands the distortions and the interpretations that characterize its own movement. So finally, to understand the world, there are three things that Merleau-Ponty talks about here. It's kind of a nice way to wrap up. To understand the world, first, we must refuse to follow perception into the visible and the sensible. Rather, we must see things according to their sense and essence. And that's the invisible. So again, the visible and the invisible cropping up here. And in order, Merleau-Ponty says, to understand them, we have to suspend them. And that, if you've read any Husserl, the use of that word will immediately jump out at you. Suspension, we have to suspend them. This is basically Merleau-Ponty's version of Husserl's reductions or his epoche. Let's just have a look at this in a bit more detail. We must refuse to follow perception into the visible and the sensible, but see things according to their sense and their essence. And in order to do this, we have to suspend the empirical nature of things. So the way that we understand things empirically as sensible objects, we have to put that on hold, and so that we can grasp them in their genuine meaning, their genuine sense. And that's fine. But why do I call this a version of Husserl's epoche? The reason is Merleau-Ponty he's enacting the epoche, but always with the intention of including the world, including the thing that he is bracketing. So he's bracketing the sensible world, but not to the point where we're not going to say anything about it. We're not interested in it. We're only interested in how we experience the world. Merleau-Ponty wants to keep us in the world. It's just that to fully grasp it, we have to refuse to follow our empirical inclinations and go down that road where everything is matter and there's physical laws and cause and effect, and we have to look beyond that if we're going to grasp world as Merleau-Ponty means it. And so in order to do that, we have to suspend those empirical facts. Whereas for Husserl, the reduction, the epoche, was more about just he didn't want anything to do with a supposed external reality. It was all what is how we understand, how we live. Our lived experience is lived first person for us. And so in order to understand that experience, Husserl's doing the same thing. He doesn't want anything to do with, we have to suspend, we have to bracket out the way that the world seems to be empirically. And then we can understand our actual lived experience. But Husserl retains that break. He never goes back to the world. He never includes the world in the way that Merleau-Ponty does, or Heidegger did, or Sartre did. So that's kind of the difference that I see between the two. Merleau-Ponty was the only one of those three philosophers who retained the Husserl's epoche or reductions, his bracketing. The others, Heidegger explicitly discounted it, or in the opening pages of Being and Time, and Sartre, I don't think he didn't say anything about it that I can remember, but he never took it up. He never said anything about bracketing the world, or that would be kind of alien to his whole philosophy. Whereas Merleau-Ponty, he was always more true to Husserl, I think, than the others, and but even in sticking with Husserl, his version of the epoche is not, I think, a version that Husserl would have recognized. Merleau-Ponty wants to stay in the world. He wants to reconquer it. So the bracketing is with a view to understanding it and us, because that's where we are. We're in that world. Husserl takes that big step back to pure ego, the transcendental ego. That's what it is for Husserl. It's transcendental phenomenology. Whereas Merleau-Ponty is not going to go in that direction. So that's probably enough about that. The second thing Merleau-Ponty says about understanding the world: to understand the world, we must articulate its meaning in language. And that's what I meant before when I said we have to reflect. Reflection, there's nothing bad about reflection as long as we remember what reflection is doing. So in order to understand the world, we have to articulate its meaning in language. And Merleau-Ponty has a nice metaphor here. He says we have to translate it. We have to translate the world. And this is precisely what philosophy's job is. It's to carry out that translation. And this is what makes the metaphor so nice, Merleau-Ponty says this translation is more than a translation, because it alone tells us what the text means. So the translation, usually if you translate something, you have the original, and you translate and you get a copy of it. But the original stands on its own. The original, if you can read the original text in the language that it was written, that's enough. But Merleau-Ponty is saying here, when we translate the world into text, into language, this is the only thing we have which can tell us what the original meant. So we can't get that level of understanding from the original, from the source document, which is the world. Only the translation gives us access to that. And that's a really nice idea. So it's a translation, but it's more than a translation, because it's our only way of understanding the original. But at the same time, the translation is less than a translation, because it's useless without the text. The translation we have of the world is useless, it's meaningless without the original, without the world itself, the world of lived experience, the world, the world of our perceptual faith. It's meaningless, it's empty without it. Whereas if you translate a book, right, the translation stands on its own, even if the original book is destroyed. As long as you've got the translation, you still have what's important. But in this case, our translation of the world is less than a translation because it means nothing without the original, which is, again, the world. So I like that metaphor. It's nice. So the suspension is to clarify the world, this bracketing. Merleau-Ponty's version of Husserl's bracketing is to clarify it, and it's this which facilitates that reconquering of the world, that grasping the world in full understanding, fully explicating, articulating its meaning. That's the whole purpose of Merleau-Ponty's epoche. So I've got a quote to kind of tie this back together with reflection. Using reflection to reduce perception to the thought of perceiving under the pretext that immanence alone is sure is to forego comprehending the effective world and move to a type of certitude that will never restore to us the there is of the world. So reflection, the reflective act, gives us certainty, reducing perception to the thought of perceiving, gives us the certainty, but it gives us a certainty that is purely immanent, that is locked within itself, that is insular. And if we do that, if we start from that position, we can never get to the world. We can never bring the world back into our understanding. We lock ourselves away in a kind of Cartesian fashion where we can understand our thought of the world, but that says absolutely nothing about the world itself. And for Merleau-Ponty, that's already secondary. It's already derivative. So it's missed. It's missed the understanding of the world. And I like that term, there is. It's a certitude, but it's a certitude that isolates us from the there is of the world. And I'm not sure who came up with that first, that expression, there is. Merleau-Ponty uses it. Heidegger uses it as well, but later. I'm not sure when he first used it, and Levinas used it as well. And I'm not sure when he first used it either. But it's a nice expression to just capture that the brute reality, the brute truth of the world, that it is there. And you miss that with reflection, because all you have is this thought of what's there. So that's a nice way to kind of close that. But the third thing he says about understanding the world. So to understand the world, we must refuse to follow perception into the visible, the sensible. We must articulate its meaning in language. We must translate it. But we must also, in order to understand the world, go not inwards, but go outwards to include the body. And that's a classic Merleau-Pontian point of focus, right? The body. And the reason is that it's through the body that this primary openness is accomplished. We only learn about the world and the thing through the body. It's our bodily engagement with the world that mediates perceptual experience. And Merleau-Ponty says it again here. He said this in Phenomenology of Perception. It's the I can precedes the I think. And so that's, again, this focus, not stepping away, not returning to the world of thought, but to place ourselves directly in the world. And there was something I wanted to say there. Oh yeah, he doesn't talk about this just here, but we have a tendency to think of the body as this connection to the world. And I just thought about it when I read that the bodily engagement mediates perceptual experience. So that really leads us to think of the body as this mediating force between us as a subject and the world over there as an object, and that's totally the wrong way to think about it. The world is not that. The subject, the body is the subject, and the world is what the subject is originally within. So there is no need for the body to be a connecting thread between two things. That throws us straight back into subject-object, right? So we want to understand the totality first. That subject-object is a secondary derivative picture. The totality is the subject as body in the world. And like I said, Merleau-Ponty doesn't go into any kind of detail here regarding the body, but it's something else we need to be aware of in order to understand the world, if we want to understand reality. And that brings us to a summary. So first up was perceptual faith. And this is faith, not knowledge. So there's no proof, but we don't need proof. The world is presupposed. The world is that which is presupposed, the most certain of all of our certainties, because it's that which grounds them all. Which means that it's faith, but it's not that kind of faith. It's not the religious kind of faith. Perceptual faith is the initial openness upon the world. So this is the way that we inhabit the world by the body. And that expression is nice, right? That initial openness upon the world. It's the original mode of our existence. To have this world, to be a part of it in this way. And the other thing that was interesting from this first part of the video was the recognition that world, for Merleau-Ponty, is the world we experience. So it's not a metaphysical claim. He's not making a claim about the nature of reality or what the world is like separate from conscious experience. That just doesn't make any sense to him. The world is the world as experienced, and that's really the phenomenological link, isn't it, for Merleau-Ponty? Experience is central to world, to reality. I'm not sure if he uses that word reality, but when I use it, all I mean by it is world. So the second part of the video was reflection. And here, perception and imagination are both modes of thinking. So this gave us an insular kind of philosophy. We never leave the circle of our thoughts. Reflection is also it's based on a constituting thought and a constituted object. So subject, object, and more importantly, this then presupposes a pre-constituted world. Because if you're able to do any kind of constituting in the first place, you must already inhabit a world. And it's that world that Merleau-Ponty is interested in. And so reflection distorts the perceived world through language. And principally it does this by using post-constituted terms. Things like subject, object, all of those words. So it inevitably distorts the perceived world. But then we come to Merleau-Ponty, and he says, rather than this being a criticism of the reflective endeavour, he says what we actually need is a hyper-reflection. So we need a reflection that takes itself and the changes that it brings about into account. That is aware of its own nature, a reflection that knows what it's doing when it reflects, and is able then to compensate for that in order to give us a true picture of the world. And finally, to understand the world, we must suspend the visible. So we have to bracket, if you like, to go all in on Husserlian language. We have to bracket the sensible, visible world, and in order to grasp the sense and the essence of the world, which is the invisible component. We also have to translate the world, so that is, articulate its meaning in language. And this is precisely philosophy's job. But in then taking up that metaphor and just running with it, Merleau-Ponty says this translation is at the same time more and less than a translation. And finally, we have to include the body. So it's a movement outwards, not a movement inwards. We're not retreating from the world to grasp our experience of it. We are trying to understand ourselves within this greater whole, this greater totality, which is the world. And this, including the body, that great expression, the I can precedes the I think. And so that's where we are today. Just a couple of things. One thing to finish with. This section, I think, is pretty much everything Merleau-Ponty is saying here is a critique of the Cartesian position, right? That division into subject and object, mind and matter, mind and body, those kinds of, that way of thinking of the world it's kind of threaded all throughout this first part of the visible and the invisible. But I read a lot of, I see a lot of a gentle critique of Husserl in this, because Husserl's phenomenology does have, I think, this, he does step back from the world and never goes back to it. He brackets the world and then never brings it back in. Even when he talked about the life world, it was kind of, that came in the 30s. It was after Heidegger had really exploded with Being and Time. And he never, even the life world, I don't think ever fully, he never placed us back in the world. He never included the world in the same way that Merleau-Ponty does. And I think it's fair to say that Husserl is a constituting thought and a constituted object. That is the core of his phenomenology, the noesis and the noema. That's the basis. And none of that has anything to do with a world more broadly considered. So, anyway, I just thought I'd finish with that. Definitely a critique of Descartes, but I think there's a gentle pushback on Husserl here as well. Merleau-Ponty never criticised Husserl that I am aware of, and he always, I think he saw himself as completing Husserl's project, but in doing so, I think he veered off in a way that Husserl would never have gone. But yeah, that's that. So thanks for watching. I hope that helped, and I'll see you in the next video.